I should have known something was wrong when Margaret showed up to my wedding rehearsal dinner wearing cream. Not ivory, not champagne, not off-white. Cream. The exact shade that would photograph as white under the venue's warm lighting. But I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, what kind of mother would sabotage her son's wedding day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my wedding to David, I woke up in the bridal suite feeling like I was living in a fairy tale. The dress, hanging on the armoire, was everything I'd dreamed of since I was 7 years old. Vintage lace, pearl buttons, a train that whispered against hardwood floors. David and I had saved for 3 years to afford this day. Every detail had been planned, budgeted, and executed with the kind of precision that comes from wanting something so badly you're willing to sacrifice everything else for it. I grew up in a small town where weddings were community events. My mother had died when I was 16, and my father had raised me alone, working double shifts at the factory to make sure I could go to college. When I met David at university, I thought I'd found my person. He was kind, ambitious, studying engineering while working nights at a restaurant to pay his way through school. We understood each other's struggles. We both came from families that had to fight for everything they got. The only complication was Margaret. David's mother had never warmed to me, not in the 4 years we'd been together. She wasn't openly hostile, just cold in that particular way some women perfect. The kind of coldness that makes you question whether you imagined the slight, the dismissive glance, the way she'd change the subject whenever David mentioned our future plans. When we announced our engagement, she'd smiled and said congratulations, but her eyes had remained flat. When we asked her to help with wedding planning, she'd politely declined, saying she was too busy with her charity work. Margaret came from old money. Not billionaire money, but the kind of generational wealth that meant she'd never had to check her bank balance before making a purchase. David had grown up in private schools, summer camps, and a house with a name instead of a street number. Rosewood Manor had been in their family for 4 generations. Margaret reminded me of this often, usually while pointing out that David could have done very well for himself if he'd focused on the right opportunities instead of wasting time on scholarship students like me. She never said it directly, of course. Margaret was far too refined for direct confrontation. Instead, she'd make comments about how David used to date Victoria, the senator's daughter. Such a lovely girl, so accomplished, spoke 3 languages fluently. Or she'd mention how surprised she was that David had chosen someone so young, so inexperienced, someone who clearly needed time to mature before taking on the responsibilities of marriage. I'd tried everything to win her over. I'd read books about etiquette and wine pairing. I'd volunteered at her charity events, wearing my best dress and smiling until my cheeks hurt. I'd brought homemade gifts to every holiday gathering, spent hours in the kitchen perfecting recipes I thought she might appreciate. Nothing worked. If anything, my efforts seemed to annoy her more. David would tell me I was imagining things, that his mother was just reserved, that she'd come around once she got to know me better. But getting to know me was apparently the last thing Margaret wanted to do. The morning of the wedding, she arrived at the venue 3 hours early. I was still in the bridal suite with my bridesmaids when I heard the commotion downstairs. My maid of honor, Jessica, had gone down to check on the flower arrangements and came back looking pale. "Amelia," she said carefully, "you might want to come see something." I followed her down the grand staircase of the historic mansion we'd rented for the ceremony. The space looked magical, exactly as we'd envisioned it. Cream roses and white peonies everywhere, candles and glass hurricanes, fairy lights strung through the ancient oak trees visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. And there, directing the photographer and adjusting centerpieces as if she owned the place, was Margaret, wearing a white dress. Not cream this time, not ivory, pure bridal white. A floor-length gown with lace sleeves and a subtle train. She looked beautiful, elegant, and completely inappropriate. Several guests had already arrived early and were milling around the cocktail area, and I watched their faces as they took in Margaret's outfit. Confusion, then understanding, then that particular kind of discomfort that comes from witnessing someone break an unspoken rule so blatantly that you don't know where to look. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said, approaching her with what I hoped was a calm voice, "you look lovely. That's quite a dress." She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Amelia, darling, don't you look sweet? A bit flushed, though. Wedding day nerves, I suppose." I waited for her to acknowledge the dress, to make some excuse or explanation. She didn't. Instead, she continued directing the photographer, pointing out angles and lighting as if this were her event, not mine. "I was wondering," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "if perhaps you'd brought another outfit. Sometimes photographs can be tricky with similar colors." Margaret paused and looked at me with the kind of expression you'd give a child who'd just said something particularly naive. "Oh, sweetheart, I wouldn't dream of changing. This dress belonged to David's grandmother. She wore it to her son's wedding. I thought it would be meaningful to honor family tradition." She was lying. I'd seen pictures of David's grandmother at his father's wedding. She'd worn navy blue. But Margaret said it with such conviction, such authority, that for a moment I wondered if I was the one who was wrong. That's what she was good at, making you question your own reality. "Besides," she continued, adjusting a flower arrangement that had been perfectly fine before she touched it, "white is such a flattering color on me. David always says I look beautiful in white." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Jessica, who had been standing behind me, made a small noise that might have been a gasp or might have been her trying not to say something she'd regret. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, that familiar flush that came whenever Margaret managed to make me feel small and stupid and young. "Of course," I said, because what else was there to say? I couldn't exactly demand that my future mother-in-law change clothes an hour before my wedding ceremony. I should go finish getting ready. As I turned to leave, I heard Margaret's voice behind me, speaking to the photographer. "Make sure you get some good shots of the family during the ceremony. David's father and I will be in the front row, of course. We want to capture this properly for posterity." I made it back to the bridal suite before the tears came. Jessica found me sitting on the little velvet chair by the window, still in my robe, staring out at the gardens where David and I had planned to take our first dance photos. "She did that on purpose," Jessica said, closing the door firmly behind her. "Everyone knows you don't wear white to someone else's wedding. She's trying to upstage you." "Maybe she's right, though," I said, and even as the words came out, I hated how small my voice sounded. Maybe David does deserve someone better, someone who knows how to handle his mother, someone who fits into his world. Are you insane?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Jessica sat down across from me. "Amelia, you've been planning this wedding for 2 years. You and David are perfect together. Don't let her get in your head." But she was already in my head. That was Margaret's specialty. She never had to raise her voice or make direct accusations. She just planted seeds of doubt and let them grow in the dark spaces of your insecurities until you started doing her work for her. I got dressed mechanically, letting the other bridesmaids fuss with my hair and makeup while I tried to figure out how to salvage what was supposed to be the most important day of my life. The photographer came up to take getting ready shots, and I smiled and laughed on cue, but inside I felt hollow. Every time I thought about walking down that aisle and seeing Margaret in the front row, wearing white, I felt sick. 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, David's best man, Cole, knocked on the door. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot in his tuxedo. "Hey, Amelia," he said, "can I talk to you for a second, privately?" Jessica and the other bridesmaids stepped out onto the balcony, giving us space. Cole sat down where Jessica had been earlier, running his hands through his hair. "Look, I don't know if I should be telling you this," he said, "but David is downstairs having a conversation with his mother that's getting pretty heated. She's saying some things that I think you should know about." My stomach dropped. What kind of things? Cole looked miserable. "She's telling him that she thinks he's making a mistake, that you're too young, too immature, that you don't understand what it means to be part of their family. She said he deserves a better wife, someone who can handle the responsibilities that come with his name." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected Margaret thought these things, but hearing them said out loud on my wedding day felt like being slapped. And she'd said them to David, trying to convince my groom to call off our wedding 20 minutes before it was supposed to start. What did David say? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Cole's expression softened. He told her to stop, that he loves you, that nothing she says is going to change his mind. But she kept pushing. She said that if he goes through with this marriage, he'll regret it within 5 years, that you'll never be able to give him the life he deserves, the social connections, the cultural understanding. She said you're holding him back from his potential. I stood up and walked to the mirror, looking at myself in the wedding dress that suddenly felt like a costume. My reflection looked back at me, pale and shaken. In a few minutes, I was supposed to walk down the aisle to marry the man I loved in front of his mother, who was actively trying to sabotage our marriage. Margaret would be sitting in the front row in her white dress, watching me promise to love and honor her son, probably counting the moments until she could say, "I told you so." "There's more," Cole said quietly. She brought up the prenup. David and I had signed a prenuptial agreement 6 months ago. It hadn't been my idea or his, but Margaret had insisted, saying it was family policy, nothing personal. The document was extensive and heavily weighted in David's favor. If we divorced within the first 5 years, I would leave with essentially nothing except my personal belongings. At the time, I'd signed it without much thought because I couldn't imagine our marriage ending. Now I wondered if Margaret had been planning for this moment all along. She reminded him about the clause regarding grounds for annulment, Cole continued. She said if there were any questions about coercion or emotional instability, the marriage could be dissolved completely. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Margaret wasn't just trying to embarrass me or make me feel unwelcome. She was laying groundwork to have our marriage declared invalid if I didn't meet her standards as a daughter-in-law. The prenup wasn't protection for David, it was a weapon for her. A knock on the door interrupted my spiral of panic. 5 minutes, Miss Chen, called the wedding coordinator. 5 minutes to decide whether to walk down that aisle, knowing that my new mother-in-law was already planning my exit. 5 minutes to figure out how to marry the man I loved, while his mother sat in the audience, wearing white, and counting down the days until she could destroy what we'd built. I looked at Cole, who was watching me with genuine concern. Does David know what she's really doing? The dress, the comments, all of it. Cole hesitated. I think he sees it as his mom being difficult, not malicious. He keeps saying she'll come around once you're officially family. He doesn't realize she doesn't want you to become family at all. 3 minutes now. Somewhere downstairs, David was waiting for me at the altar, probably relieved that he'd stood up to his mother, thinking the worst was over. He had no idea that Margaret's real campaign hadn't even begun yet. The white dress, the cruel comments, the last-minute doubts she'd planted, these were just the opening moves in what I now realized was going to be a much longer game. I could walk down that aisle and pretend everything was fine. I could smile for the photos and dance at the reception and hope that love would be enough to overcome everything Margaret had planned for us. I could spend my marriage trying to prove that I was worthy of her son, always falling short, always giving her more ammunition to use against me. Or I could acknowledge what I'd been trying not to see for 4 years. This wasn't just about a difficult mother-in-law or wedding day jitters. This was about a woman who had decided I wasn't good enough for her son and was willing to destroy my marriage to prove her point. Margaret had made her position clear. The question was what I was going to do about it. 2 minutes. Time to decide whether I was going to spend the rest of my life fighting a war I hadn't realized I was already losing, or whether I was going to find another way to win. I looked at my reflection one more time. At the dress David had cried when he first saw me try on, at the flowers Jessica had woven into my hair, at the woman who had worked so hard to be perfect for a family that would never accept her. And for the first time since Margaret had walked into my wedding wearing white, I smiled, because I just remembered something important, something that might change everything. The venue coordinator knocked again. "Miss Chen, it's time." "I'm coming," I called back, my voice steady for the first time all day. But I wasn't walking down that aisle to become Mrs. David Hartwell, at least not yet. First, I had a few things to take care of, things that would help Margaret understand exactly who she'd been underestimating for the past 4 years. Because while she'd been busy planning my downfall, I'd been busy learning things about the Hartwell family that even David didn't know. Things that made Margaret's white dress and cruel comments look like child's play compared to what I could do if I really wanted to fight back. The difference was, I'd never wanted to fight before. I'd wanted to belong, to be accepted, to find my place in their world. But Margaret had just made it clear that there would never be a place for me in her version of the Hartwell family. So maybe it was time to create my own version instead. I walked to the door, my train rustling behind me, and paused with my hand on the handle. In a few minutes, everything was going to change. Margaret thought she held all the cards, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I was as naive and powerless as I appeared. She was about to learn how wrong she was. I walked down that aisle after all, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Every step felt deliberate, calculated, like I was moving chess pieces into position rather than floating toward my happily ever after. The guests rose as the music swelled, and I could feel their eyes on me. But my focus was laser sharp on the front row where Margaret sat in her pristine white gown, hands folded primly in her lap, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed she'd already won. David looked radiant when he saw me. His face lit up with the kind of joy that makes you believe in soulmates and forever promises. For a moment, my resolve wavered. He was innocent in all of this. He genuinely loved me. And his happiness at seeing me walk toward him was so pure it almost broke my heart. But then I caught Margaret's eye over his shoulder, and I saw the smug satisfaction there, the certainty that she'd successfully planted enough doubt to poison whatever came next. The ceremony proceeded exactly as rehearsed. I said my vows, meaning every word, while David's voice cracked with emotion during his. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the kiss felt like a promise and a battle cry all at once. The photographer captured it all, Margaret's white dress prominent in every family photo, exactly as she'd planned. But during the cocktail hour, while guests mingled and sipped champagne on the terrace, I excused myself and made a phone call that would change everything. "Rebecca, it's Amelia. Yes, I know it's my wedding day. Listen, I need you to pull together everything we discussed about the Hartwell Foundation audit. No, not Monday. Tonight. I know it's Saturday, but this can't wait." Rebecca had been my study partner in graduate school, back when I was working on my master's degree in nonprofit management while David finished his engineering program. She'd gone on to work for the State Attorney General's office in their charitable organization investigation unit. 3 months ago, during one of our regular coffee dates, she'd mentioned that her office had received several anonymous complaints about irregularities in the Hartwell Foundation's financial reporting. Margaret served as the foundation's president and primary fundraiser. At the time, I'd brushed it off. David's family charity work seemed above reproach, all garden parties and scholarship funds and tasteful galas. But Rebecca had persisted, showing me public tax documents that didn't quite add up, grant applications that listed recipients who didn't seem to exist, and expense reports that included some very creative interpretations of administrative costs. "I'm not saying they're definitely doing anything illegal," Rebecca had said, "but there are enough red flags that we're building a case for a formal investigation. The problem is, we need someone with inside access to provide documentation that we can't obtain through public records." I'd declined to help then, horrified at the idea of spying on David's family. But that was before Margaret had made her position crystal clear. Before she'd worn white to my wedding and told my groom he deserved a better wife 20 minutes before the ceremony. "How quickly can you put together a preliminary report?" I asked Rebecca now, stepping into the venue's library where no one could overhear. "If you can get me access to their internal financial records, maybe 48 hours. But Amelia, are you sure about this? Once we start an official investigation, there's no going back." I thought about Margaret's face during the ceremony, the way she'd smiled when David stumbled slightly over his vows, as if his nervousness proved her point about me being the wrong choice. I thought about her white dress, her calculated cruelty, her absolute certainty that I would never be able to touch her or her perfect world. "I'm sure," I said. "Send me a list of what you need." The reception began with the kind of orchestrated perfection that money can buy. The ballroom at Rosewood Manor had been transformed into something from a magazine, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables draped in silk and decorated with flowers that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Margaret had insisted on hosting the reception at the family estate, and now I understood why. On her home turf, she was the undisputed queen, holding court at the head table, while David and I sat slightly to her left, symbolically positioned as secondary characters in her show. During dinner, she gave a speech that was a masterpiece of passive aggression disguised as maternal love. She spoke about David's childhood, his achievements, his bright future, and his need for a partner who could support his ambitions without holding him back. She never mentioned my name or looked directly at me, but every word was clearly directed at the inadequate woman who had somehow tricked her precious son into marriage. David has always been drawn to projects, she said, getting a polite laugh from the crowd. Even as a child, he loved fixing things, improving them, helping them reach their potential. I have no doubt that his nurturing spirit will continue to guide him in all his relationships. The implication was clear. I was David's latest project, something broken that he was trying to fix out of misguided kindness. The guests laughed again, but I caught the uncomfortable glances, the way some of them looked between Margaret and me with dawning understanding of what they were witnessing. David, oblivious to the subtext, beamed at his mother and squeezed my hand under the table. "Isn't she amazing?" he whispered. "I'm so glad you two are finally going to be family." I smiled and nodded, but internally I was calculating. Margaret thought she was humiliating me in front of 200 guests, establishing her dominance from day one of my marriage. What she didn't realize was that she was giving me evidence. Every cruel comment, every public slight, every demonstration of her true feelings toward me was being witnessed by people who would remember when the time came. After dinner, during the dancing, I found my moment. Margaret was holding court near the bar, surrounded by her social circle, accepting compliments on the beautiful reception and her stunning dress. I approached with 2 glasses of champagne and the kind of smile I'd perfected during 4 years of trying to find her approval. "Margaret, you look absolutely radiant tonight," I said, offering her a glass. "That dress is truly spectacular. David mentioned it belonged to his grandmother?" Margaret's eyes sharpened slightly, but she accepted the champagne with a gracious smile. "Family heirloom, darling. I thought it was important to honor tradition on such a significant day." Her friends murmured appreciation, though I noticed a few exchanged glances. Everyone knew the rule about wearing white to someone else's wedding, but Margaret's social position made direct confrontation impossible. "How thoughtful of you to preserve family history," I continued. "Speaking of family traditions, I've been so impressed by the foundation's work. David tells me you've raised over $2 million for scholarships this year alone. That's incredible." Margaret preened at the praise, her guard dropping slightly. "The foundation is my life's work, helping young people achieve their educational goals, supporting the arts, maintaining our cultural institutions. It's what gives my life meaning." "I'd love to learn more about how it operates," I said. "Perhaps you could show me the grant application process. I have some background in nonprofit management from my graduate work, and I'd be honored to contribute to such important work." This was the test. If Margaret had nothing to hide, she would welcome my interest, especially since involving David's new wife in the family charity would look good to their social circle. But if Rebecca's suspicions were correct, Margaret would find ways to keep me at arm's length from the foundation's inner workings. Margaret's smile became strained. "How sweet of you to offer, but the foundation is quite complex. We work with very sophisticated donors and grant recipients. Perhaps after you've had more time to settle into married life, we could discuss some small volunteer opportunities." Strike one. She was already positioning me as too inexperienced and incompetent to handle real responsibility within the organization. "Of course," I said, maintaining my bright smile. "I completely understand, though I am curious about one thing. David mentioned that the foundation recently funded a scholarship program for underserved students in the metro area. As someone who benefited from need-based aid myself, I'd love to connect with some of the recipients, maybe create a mentorship program." Margaret's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "I'm not sure which program you're referring to, dear. We fund so many initiatives." Strike two. Rebecca had shown me the tax documents listing a grant for exactly that purpose, paid to an organization that didn't seem to exist at the address provided. If it were legitimate, Margaret would know every detail of a program that represented nearly a quarter of their annual giving. Oh, I might have misunderstood, I said. David sometimes gets excited about the foundation's work, and I think I confused the details. Maybe it was the arts education program for low-income schools? Another flicker. Another program Rebecca had flagged as questionable. Amelia, darling, Margaret said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. I think you're overestimating David's involvement in the foundation's day-to-day operations. He's always been more interested in his engineering work than philanthropy. Perhaps he was telling you about someone else's charity work. Strike 3. David had shown me detailed emails about foundation projects, discussed grant applications over dinner, and spent hours explaining his mother's philanthropic vision. Either Margaret was lying about his involvement, or she was setting up plausible deniability for when questions arose about the foundation's activities. You're probably right, I said, playing the role of the confused young wife perfectly. I'm still learning so much about the family. Thank you for being so patient with me. Margaret's smile returned, genuine this time, because she believed she'd successfully deflected my interest while reinforcing my position as an outsider who didn't understand their world. Of course, sweetheart, these things take time. As I walked away, I felt the phone in my clutch vibrate with a text from Rebecca. Got your list. Already found 3 red flags in public records. This is bigger than we thought. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of congratulations and small talk, but my mind was elsewhere, processing everything I'd learned and planning my next moves. David was radiantly happy, dancing with his mother, his new wife, his friends, completely oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him. He saw his wedding day as the beginning of his perfect life, with the woman he loved finally becoming part of his family. I saw it as the day I'd declared war on a woman who'd spent 4 years trying to destroy my relationship and had now made the mistake of doing it publicly, in front of witnesses, while potentially committing federal crimes through her charitable organization. Near midnight, as the last guests were leaving and the staff began cleaning up, Margaret cornered me near the coat check. Her white dress was still pristine, her makeup perfect, but there was something different in her eyes. Calculation mixed with satisfaction and just a hint of threat. I hope you enjoyed your special day, Amelia, she said, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. It's important to savor these moments, don't you think, before real life sets in? It was perfect, I replied. Thank you for hosting such a beautiful reception and for making your feelings about our marriage so clear to everyone present. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. Of course not, I said, just like I'm sure you didn't realize how your dress choice would photograph, or how your speech would sound to people who don't know our family dynamics. But don't worry, I understand completely now. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret looked uncertain. She'd expected me to be hurt, intimidated, possibly in tears. She hadn't expected calm acknowledgement and what might have been a veiled threat. David is very lucky to have such a devoted mother, I continued, someone who's willing to do anything to protect what she thinks is best for him. I just hope that devotion doesn't extend to areas where it might cause problems. The uncertainty in Margaret's eyes sharpened into something more dangerous. What exactly are you trying to say? Nothing at all, I said, smiling the same bright smile I'd worn all evening. Just that I'm looking forward to being part of the family, learning about all the family traditions, the foundation work, the business connections. I'm sure there's so much you can teach me about how things really work. Margaret stared at me for a long moment, trying to decode the conversation we'd just had. Finally, David appeared at my side, slightly drunk and gloriously happy, wrapping his arms around both of us. My 2 favorite women, he said, kissing the top of my head. I'm so glad you're finally getting to know each other better. Yes, Margaret said, her eyes never leaving mine. I think we understand each other perfectly now. As David and I left for our honeymoon suite at the estate's guest house, I felt Margaret's gaze following us. She was trying to figure out what had just happened, whether I was the naive girl she'd been tormenting for years or something else entirely. She was smart enough to recognize that something had shifted, but not smart enough to realize how much danger she was actually in. In the guest house, David was euphoric, spinning me around the room in my wedding dress, talking about how perfect everything had been, how beautiful I'd looked, how happy he was that his mother had clearly made an effort to welcome me into the family. "Did you see how she kept complimenting your dress during pictures?" he said, fumbling with his bow tie. "And that speech she gave, talking about nurturing and support, I think she was trying to tell everyone how glad she is that I found you." I helped him with his tie, listening to his interpretation of the evening with something between heartbreak and rage. He'd seen his mother's cruelty as love, her insults as compliments, her public humiliation of his wife as maternal blessing. Either he was willfully blind, or Margaret had spent years training him not to see her true nature. "She was certainly memorable tonight," I said, carefully. "I know she can seem a little formal sometimes," David said, sitting on the bed to remove his shoes. "But that's just how she was raised. Once she gets comfortable with you, she'll be like a second mother." A second mother. The woman who'd worn white to my wedding, told my groom he deserved better, and was potentially embezzling money from a charitable foundation. I looked at my husband, sweet and trusting and completely clueless about the war his mother had just declared, and felt something crystallize inside me. Margaret thought I was too weak, too naive, too powerless to fight back. She'd spent the evening demonstrating her dominance, secure in the knowledge that I had no weapons to use against her. She'd underestimated me completely, and now she was going to pay for that mistake. But first, I had to decide how much collateral damage I was willing to accept, because bringing down Margaret Hartwell wasn't going to be a surgical strike. When her world crumbled, pieces of it would inevitably fall on David, and I had to be prepared for the possibility that he might choose his mother over the truth. I watched him get ready for bed, humming our wedding song under his breath, still glowing with happiness from what he believed had been the perfect day. In a few hours, we'd leave for our honeymoon in Italy, 2 weeks of romantic bliss before returning to start our married life. Margaret probably thought those 2 weeks would give her time to begin her next phase of operations, whatever psychological warfare she'd planned to drive a wedge between David and me. She had no idea that I'd be spending our honeymoon building a case that would destroy everything she'd worked to create. My phone buzzed with another message from Rebecca. "Preliminary review complete. You need to see this. Can you talk tomorrow?" I typed back quickly. "Flying to Rome in the morning. Send everything to my secure email. I'll review on the plane." David emerged from the bathroom in his pajamas, looking like an overgrown boy despite being 28 years old. "No work emails on our honeymoon," he said, settling into bed beside me. "I want 2 weeks of just us. No family, no obligations, no outside world." "Of course," I agreed, setting my phone aside. "Just us." But as he drifted off to sleep beside me, his arm draped across my waist, I was already planning. Margaret had made her choice when she decided to wear white to my wedding. She'd made it again when she told David he deserved a better wife. And she'd sealed her fate when she'd dismissed my questions about the foundation with barely concealed contempt. She thought she was dealing with a naive girl who could be intimidated into submission. Instead, she'd just handed me the motivation I needed to do something I should have done years ago, something that would prove, once and for all, exactly who deserved to be part of the Hartwell family. The irony was perfect. Margaret had spent the evening trying to demonstrate that I didn't belong in their world. By the time I was finished, she'd be the one on the outside looking in. But that night, lying in the guest house at Rosewood Manor with my new husband sleeping peacefully beside me, I allowed myself one moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. Whatever came next, whatever wars I had to fight, whatever prices I had to pay, I was married to the man I loved. Margaret could take a lot of things from me, but she couldn't take that. The white dress had been her declaration of war. Tomorrow, she'd start learning what happened when you underestimated someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Rome should have been magical. David had planned every detail of our honeymoon with the same careful attention he brought to his engineering projects. Private tours of the Vatican, sunset dinners overlooking the Trevi Fountain, morning walks through Villa Borghese gardens. He wanted to show me the world, to start our marriage with beauty and wonder and the kind of memories that would sustain us through ordinary life. Instead, I spent our first morning in Italy reviewing federal tax documents on my laptop while David slept off jet lag beside me. Rebecca had sent everything, and it was worse than I'd imagined. The Hartwell Foundation wasn't just sloppy with their bookkeeping, they were running a sophisticated money laundering operation disguised as charitable giving. Fake recipient organizations with legitimate-sounding names, grants that disappeared into shell companies, administrative expenses that paid for Margaret's personal lifestyle while she claimed poverty wages as foundation president, educational scholarships awarded to children who didn't exist, art acquisitions for museums that had no record of receiving them. It was elaborate, careful, and had been going on for at least 8 years. Margaret hadn't just insulted me at my wedding, she'd been stealing from legitimate charities, defrauding the government, and using her social position to cover crimes that could send her to federal prison for decades. The beautiful thing was, she'd handed me the keys to destroy her herself. David stirred as I closed the laptop, stretching and smiling that sleepy smile that had made me fall in love with him. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, pulling me down for a kiss. "How does it feel to wake up in Rome as a married woman?" "Surreal," I said, which was true for reasons he couldn't imagine. We spent the day playing tourist, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time David pointed out architectural details or shared historical facts he'd researched for our trip, I was calculating timelines and evidence chains. When he bought me flowers from a street vendor, I was thinking about paper trails. When he photographed me throwing coins into the Trevi Fountain, I was planning the most elegant revenge in the history of mother-in-law relationships. That evening, over dinner at a tiny restaurant in Trastevere, David's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and smiled apologetically. "It's Mom. She probably wants to hear about our first day." I watched him answer, his face lighting up as he described our adventures to Margaret. She was checking in, maintaining contact, making sure her influence over him remained strong even from thousands of miles away. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, filled with David's enthusiastic recounting and Margaret's careful questions about my behavior, my mood, my adjustment to married life. "She sounds worried that you're homesick," David said after hanging up. "She suggested we call every few days so you don't feel disconnected from family." Of course she did. Margaret wanted intelligence reports, regular updates on whether her psychological warfare was working. She was probably expecting me to crack under the pressure of being the inadequate wife she'd proclaimed me to be. "That's thoughtful of her," I said, cutting into my ossobuco with deliberate precision. The next morning, I called Rebecca while David was in the shower. "How solid is the case?" "Rock solid. But Amelia, this isn't just about Margaret. David's name is on some of these documents as a board member. His signature is on grant approvals." My stomach dropped. "How many?" "Enough that he could be charged as an accessory if we can't prove he was unaware of the fraud. Either he's been willfully ignorant for years, or he's more involved than you think." I stared out our hotel window at the Roman skyline, processing this new complication. David wasn't innocent. He might not have been the mastermind, but he'd signed documents, approved expenditures, participated in board meetings where these decisions were made. Either he was incredibly naive or incredibly good at playing dumb. What do you need from me to protect him? Evidence that he was misled or manipulated. Documentation showing Margaret controlled information flow, made decisions without proper board consultation, forged signatures, anything that demonstrates he was kept in the dark about the illegal activity. I thought about David's enthusiastic discussions of foundation work, his pride in the scholarship programs, his genuine belief in their charitable mission. Either he was an Oscar-worthy actor, or Margaret had been very careful to show him only the legitimate side of their operations. I can get that, but I need time to do it right. How much time? Give me 3 months. To build the case properly, I want Margaret to go down hard, but I want David protected completely. For the rest of our honeymoon, I played the perfect new bride while secretly documenting everything I could remember about David's involvement with the foundation.
Every conversation, every document he'd shown me, every detail about how Margaret controlled information and decision-making. I needed to prove that she'd deliberately kept him ignorant of the criminal activity while using his name and reputation to legitimize her operation. We returned to the States 2 weeks later, tanned and happy, and apparently settled into domestic bliss. David had rented us a charming townhouse in Georgetown, close to his engineering firm, and far enough from Rosewood Manor to give us privacy. Margaret had insisted on hosting a welcome home dinner our first night back, and I accepted with the kind of gracious enthusiasm that David beamed with pride. The dinner was intimate, just family, with Margaret playing the role of doting mother-in-law perfectly. She asked about our trip, complimented my tan, and presented us with a wedding gift she claimed to have forgotten in the pre-ceremony chaos, a set of antique silverware that had belonged to David's great-grandmother, a family heirloom that symbolized my acceptance into their lineage. "I wanted to wait until you were both settled," she said, watching me unwrap the ornate serving pieces. "These have been passed down to every Hartwell bride for 4 generations. I hope you'll treasure them as much as we have." It was a masterful performance. In front of David and his father, Margaret was welcoming, generous, the picture of maternal grace. But I caught the calculation in her eyes when she looked at me, the way she assessed my reactions, searching for signs that her wedding day psychological attack had done lasting damage. "They're beautiful," I said, running my fingers over the intricate engravings. "I'm honored to be trusted with such precious family history." Margaret smiled, but I saw the flicker of irritation at my composed response. She'd expected gratitude, mixed with insecurity, the behavior of someone still trying to prove herself worthy. Instead, I was treating the gift as my due, the natural inheritance of a legitimate family member. After dinner, while David and his father discussed business in the study, Margaret invited me to see her private office. It was a shrine to her social importance, walls covered with photos of charity galas, award ceremonies, and society events. Her desk was an antique mahogany piece that dominated the room, covered with correspondence from prominent donors and civic leaders. "I thought we should have a chat," she said, settling into her chair with the air of a queen granting an audience. "About expectations, now that you're officially part of the family." Here it was, the real conversation, without David present to witness it. "Of course," I said, taking the chair across from her desk. "I'm eager to learn how I can contribute." Margaret studied me for a moment, perhaps surprised again by my directness. The Hartwell name carries significant social obligations. We're expected to maintain certain standards, support particular causes, associate with appropriate people. I hope you understand that these aren't arbitrary rules, but responsibilities that come with privilege. Absolutely, I agreed. I've been thinking about how I might support the Foundation's work, given my background in nonprofit management. Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. As I mentioned at the wedding, the Foundation's operations are quite sophisticated. Perhaps you could start with some volunteer activities, helping with event planning, or donor cultivation. "I'd be happy to help anywhere you think I'd be useful," I said. Though I have to admit, I'm particularly interested in the grant selection process. In my graduate work, I focused on program evaluation and impact assessment. I'd love to see how you measure the effectiveness of your charitable investments. It was a direct challenge, phrased as eager assistance. Margaret's smile became strained. "Our evaluation methods are quite established," she said carefully. "We work with professional consultants who specialize in philanthropic assessment." "That sounds fascinating. I'd love to meet them, learn about their methodology. Are they local, or do you work with a national firm?" Margaret was trapped. Either she had to provide details about evaluators who didn't exist, or admit that the Foundation didn't actually assess their grant recipients because many of those recipients were fictional. "I'm not sure this level of operational detail is appropriate for someone so new to the organization," she said, abandoning pretense of welcoming collaboration. "Perhaps we should focus on areas more suited to your experience level." There it was, the real Margaret, dismissive and controlling, unable to tolerate the possibility that I might have legitimate skills or insights to offer. She wanted me to know my place, to accept that I would always be peripheral to the important family business. "Of course," I said. "I wouldn't want to overstep, though I hope eventually I'll be able to contribute more substantially. David speaks so passionately about the foundation's mission, and I'd hate for him to think I wasn't committed to the family's philanthropic legacy. Margaret's eyes sharpened at the mention of David's expectations. She was calculating how to manage this new dynamic, how to keep me excluded without creating friction with her son. David's enthusiasm sometimes exceeds his practical understanding, she said. He has a generous heart, but he's never been involved in the day-to-day management decisions. Those require experience and judgment that come from years of nonprofit leadership. Perfect. She was establishing that David was kept out of operational details, that major decisions were made without his input. It was exactly the kind of statement I needed to document his lack of awareness about illegal activities. I'm sure his trust in your leadership is complete, I said. He's told me how much he admires your ability to handle complex organizational challenges. Margaret preened slightly at the compliment, missing the trap I was setting. It's demanding work, but someone has to ensure proper stewardship of the resources entrusted to us. Over the following weeks, I played the role of eager daughter-in-law perfectly, while carefully documenting everything Margaret revealed about the foundation's operations. She couldn't resist demonstrating her importance and expertise, especially when she thought she was proving my inadequacy by comparison. Every conversation gave me more evidence of how she controlled information, made unilateral decisions, and kept David ignorant of questionable activities. Meanwhile, Rebecca's investigation was progressing rapidly. The state attorney general's office had opened a formal inquiry, and federal authorities were taking interest in the interstate money transfers. They needed inside access to clinch the case, and I was positioned to provide exactly what they required. The perfect opportunity came 6 weeks after our return from Rome. Margaret was hosting the Foundation's annual gala, a black tie event that raised funds for their scholarship program. She'd asked me to help with logistics, assuming I'd be grateful for the chance to prove myself useful. Instead, I used my access to copy financial records, donor databases, and grant applications. Everything Rebecca needed to demonstrate the scope of the fraud. The scholarship recipients who existed only on paper, the administrative expenses that paid Margaret's personal bills, the art purchases that never reached their intended destinations. The gala itself was a monument to Margaret's social power. 300 guests in designer gowns and custom tuxedos, paying $5,000 per table to support what they believed was legitimate charitable work. Margaret held court like a benevolent queen, accepting praise for her dedication to education and social justice while secretly stealing the money meant for actual students and causes. I watched her give a speech about the importance of providing opportunities for deserving young people, knowing that the scholarship money was being diverted to offshore accounts. I smiled and applauded with everyone else, playing my part while internally counting the federal crimes being committed in real time. David was radiant, proud of his mother's humanitarian work and his wife's growing involvement in family philanthropy. He introduced me to donors as his partner in continuing the Hartwell legacy of charitable leadership. He had no idea that within weeks, that legacy would be exposed as an elaborate criminal enterprise. The investigation moved swiftly once Rebecca had the internal documentation. Federal agents executed search warrants on the Foundation offices and Rosewood Manor simultaneously. They seized computers, financial records, and personal documents spanning nearly a decade of fraudulent activity. David was at work when it happened. I was the one who got the call from Margaret, her voice shaking with rage and panic. "What have you done?" she demanded. "Federal agents are in my home, going through my private papers. They're asking about foundation finances, about you, about documents that should be confidential." "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, calmly, though my heart was racing. "What kind of documents?" "Don't play innocent with me. This is your revenge for the wedding, isn't it? You couldn't handle being put in your place, so you've decided to destroy the family that welcomed you." The irony was breathtaking. Margaret thought this was about her wearing white to my wedding, her cruel comments, her social humiliation. She had no idea that she'd handed me legitimate grounds to bring down a criminal operation that had been stealing from actual charities for years. "Margaret, I think you're overwrought. Why don't you call your lawyer and let them sort this out?" "My lawyer?" She laughed bitterly. "They've frozen our accounts, seized our computers, confiscated foundation files. Do you understand what you've done? You've destroyed everything our family built. No, I thought. You destroyed it when you decided to steal from people who actually needed help. I just documented the evidence. David came home that evening shattered and confused. The FBI had interviewed him at his office, asking detailed questions about his role in foundation operations, his knowledge of grant recipients, his involvement in financial decisions. He'd answered honestly, describing his limited participation and his mother's control over day-to-day management. They think we've been stealing from charity, he said, sitting heavily on our couch with his head in his hands. Mom, stealing from charity? It's impossible. She's devoted her life to helping people. I sat beside him, rubbing his back while he processed the destruction of his worldview. What did you tell them? The truth. That Mom handles all the operational details, that I sign documents she prepares, that I trust her judgment completely.
They seemed particularly interested in the scholarship program, asking for names of recipients, details about selection criteria. My stomach clenched. If David had provided specific information about scholarship recipients, he might have inadvertently revealed his knowledge that some of them didn't exist. His honesty could be interpreted as either innocence or a carefully constructed cover story. Did they indicate what kind of evidence they have? David looked up at me with haunted eyes. They have financial records showing money going to organizations that don't exist, grant applications with forged documents, administrative expenses that paid for Mom's personal travel and shopping. They showed me my signature on approvals for payments to scholarship recipients who were never enrolled in any school. He was beginning to understand the scope of what Margaret had done and his role in legitimizing it through his board participation. Even if he'd been unaware of the fraud, his signature was on documents approving illegal transactions. David, I need you to listen to me carefully. This investigation isn't about your mother's reputation or family embarrassment. If they can prove criminal intent, she could go to federal prison. And if they think you were aware of illegal activity, you could be charged as an accessory. The color drained from his face. But I didn't know. I trusted her. She's my mother. I know, but trust isn't a legal defense. You need to get your own lawyer, separate from whatever representation Margaret has. You need to cooperate fully with the investigation and document everything you can remember about how she controlled information and decision-making. David stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. The idea that his beloved mother was not only a criminal, but had potentially set him up to take the fall was beyond his comprehension. "How do you know so much about federal investigations?" he asked slowly. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the moment when I had to decide how much truth to reveal about my role in Margaret's downfall. "Because I've been working with the investigators for months," I said quietly. "I provided them with the evidence they needed to build this case." David went very still. "You what?" "Margaret has been committing federal crimes for years, stealing money meant for actual students, actual charitable causes. I gave the authorities documentation of her fraud." David stood up slowly, backing away from me like I was dangerous. "You destroyed my family. You destroyed my mother." "Your mother destroyed herself when she decided to steal from charity. I just documented the evidence." "She was right about you," he said, his voice hollow. "She said you'd never really be family, that you'd turn on us eventually. She knew what you were." The words hit like physical blows, but I forced myself to stay calm. "David, your mother wore white to our wedding and told you that you deserved a better wife 20 minutes before the ceremony. She spent 4 years trying to drive us apart, and she's been stealing money meant for people who actually need help. She's not the victim here. So you decided to be judge and jury? You decided to destroy her because she hurt your feelings?" I stood up to face him, angry now. "I decided to stop a criminal who was stealing from legitimate charities while using your name and reputation to legitimize her fraud. She put you at risk, David. She put your signature on illegal documents and let you believe you were helping people when you were actually helping her steal." David stared at me for a long moment, trying to reconcile the wife he thought he knew with the woman who had orchestrated his mother's arrest. "Get out," he said quietly. "David, please. Get out of my house. Get out of my life. I can't look at you right now. I packed a bag and went to a hotel, giving David space to process what had happened. Margaret was released on bail after 3 days, but the charges were extensive: mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. If convicted on all counts, she was looking at decades in federal prison. David filed for divorce 2 weeks later. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. The prenuptial agreement Margaret had insisted on left me with almost nothing, and David's lawyer argued that my cooperation with federal investigators constituted fraud that voided any spousal claims. I didn't fight it. I'd known the price when I made my choice. Margaret's trial became a society scandal, with daily coverage in the local papers and whispered conversations at every social event. The details of her fraud were extensive and damning. Millions of dollars diverted from charitable purposes into personal accounts. Fake organizations created to justify payments to Margaret's friends and family members. Scholarship recipients who existed only on paper, while real students were denied assistance. David testified for the prosecution, confirming his limited knowledge of operational details and his reliance on his mother's explanations. His testimony, combined with the evidence I'd provided, painted a clear picture of Margaret as the mastermind and David as an unwitting accomplice. Margaret was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. David was granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, but his reputation was destroyed. The engineering firm quietly asked for his resignation, and his social circle evaporated overnight. I went back to my maiden name and moved across the country, starting over in a city where no one knew about the Hartwell Foundation scandal. I found work with a legitimate nonprofit, this time one that actually helped the people it claimed to serve. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, if I should have found another way to handle Margaret's cruelty, one that didn't destroy my marriage or send my husband's mother to prison. But then I think about the real students who were denied scholarships because Margaret stole their funding, the legitimate charities that lost donations because people thought they were supporting education instead of Margaret's lifestyle. Margaret was right about one thing: I never really belonged in their world of inherited privilege and social pretense. But she was wrong about what that meant. She thought it made me weak, disposable, someone who could be discarded when I became inconvenient. Instead, it made me someone who understood the value of what she was stealing, someone who knew that charitable work was supposed to help people, not fund personal shopping trips and lavish vacations. Margaret was right about one thing: I never really belonged in their world of inherited privilege and social pretense. But she was wrong about what that meant. She thought it made me weak, disposable, someone who could be discarded when I became inconvenient. Instead, it made me someone who understood the value of what she was stealing, someone who knew that charitable work was supposed to help people, not fund personal shopping trips and lavish vacations, someone who wouldn't look the other way when trust was weaponized to hurt the people who needed help most. The white dress was Margaret's declaration that I didn't deserve to be part of their family. In the end, she was right. I deserved something better than a family built on lies, sustained by fraud, and held together by the suffering of people they claimed to help. David made his choice when he asked me to leave rather than confront the truth about his mother. I made mine when I decided that some things matter more than keeping peace with people who profit from other people's pain. I sleep well at night knowing that Margaret's victims finally got justice, even if it came at a price I'm still paying. Some battles are worth fighting, even when you have to fight them alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.